Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Somewhere beneath the surface of Titan, Saturn's largest moon, there is a room that most people in the Imperium of Man do not know exists. The moon itself is not on any official imperial charts. The fortress that squats upon its surface, a black-spired monument carved entirely from basalt and pressed into the shadow of a mountain called Mount Anak, is not listed in the administratum's rolls. No shipping lane acknowledges it. No courier runs supplies to its gates. No astropathic relay carries its name. To the billion-strong population of the Sol system going about their lives in the shadow of a decaying empire, Titan is simply another piece of debris orbiting Saturn, and whatever might live there is simply not their concern. But it exists. Deep beneath the ice sheets and the oceans of liquid methane that coat Titan's surface, beneath the catacombs and the silent hallways where the armored dead are kept in rows of stone tombs, stretching back across 10,000 years of war, there is a chamber within a larger chamber, and inside that inner sanctum, sealed away behind wards and locks, and the psychic will of a brotherhood of warrior monks, who have spent their entire lives learning how to resist everything the darkest corners of reality can throw at them. There is a box. It is a plain wooden box, not carved from some exotic alien timber, not reinforced with blessed adamantium, or sealed with sigils of warding burned into its surface by a master artisan. Not impressive, exactly, in the way that sacred relics of a 10,000-year-old galactic civilization tend to be impressive. It is just a simple wooden box. The kind of thing you might find in the corner of a carpenter's workshop, or on a market stall on some unremarkable agri-world. The only thing that marks it as anything other than ordinary is a single golden seal pressed into the lid. A seal so old that the wax beneath has long since petrified into something closer to stone. A seal bearing a mark that very, very few eyes in the Imperium of Man have ever seen, and that fewer still have recognized for what it is. Because that seal is a perfect match for another seal, found in only one other location across the breadth of a galaxy that stretches for 100,000 light years in every direction. That other seal sits upon the Emperor's golden throne in the heart of the Imperial Palace on Terra. Think about what that means for a moment. Really let it sit with you. The Imperium of Man is the largest human civilization in history, a sprawling empire of roughly 1 million inhabited worlds, each one containing populations that range from a few thousand hardy survivors to hive cities piling billions of souls onto a single continental landmass. The Golden Throne is the most sacred object in that civilization, the life support system and the weapon of last resort for the greatest being humanity has ever produced. A living legend, so old and so powerful that he spent nearly 7,000 years quietly steering the development of the entire species before deciding, with characteristic understatement, that it was finally time to unify the fractured warlord kingdoms of his home planet. And there is a plain wooden box on a hidden moon of Saturn that bears the exact same seal. Nobody opens it. There is only one person in the entire Imperium of Man who is even permitted to know that the box exists. That person is the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, the chapter master of the most secret, most fearsome, most psychically gifted brotherhood of space marines in the history of the setting. Even within the Grey Knights themselves, the knowledge is kept from all but the topmost rank. It does not matter that you have fought 10,000 demons. It does not matter that you have walked through the Eye of Terror and come back intact. It does not matter that you have spent a century memorizing the Librarium Daemonica and can quote chapter and verse from the most forbidden demonological texts in imperial possession. If you are not the supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, you do not know the box exists. And if you somehow found out anyway, that information would be considered extraordinarily hazardous. The one person who does know is not permitted to open it unless they have determined with absolute certainty that all hope for the future of humanity has been extinguished. Not all hope for a particular campaign. Not all hope for a particular world or a particular sector or even a particular segmentum. All hope for humanity itself. The last candle in the darkness. The moment when the final calculation has been run and the answer that comes back says there is nothing left. And still, for 10,000 years, across every crisis and catastrophe, the Imperium has survived. The War of the Beast, the Age of Apostasy, the 13th Black Crusade, and the fall of Cardia, the tearing of the Great Rift across the galaxy's face. Now the return of the Primarch Robert Guilliman. Events each individually catastrophic enough to reshape entire civilizations. Nobody has opened the box. Nobody has even come close to opening the box. In any official account, the box just sits there, patient, silent, bearing its golden seal and the weight of an unimaginable secret, in a chamber said to hold the tomb of the man who put it there. That man's name was Malcador the Sigillite, and who he was, what he did, why he built what he built, and what in the name of everything sacred he actually wrote on that piece of parchment inside the box. That is what we are here to talk about today. So settle in. This one goes deep. Section 2. Who was Malcador the Sigillite? Before we can understand the box, we need to understand the man who made it. And understanding Malcador is not a simple task, because Malcador himself spent most of his impossibly long life making sure that understanding him remained difficult. His official title was the Sigillite. The word comes from an old Terran language, and it means, roughly, seal-bearer. The reference is layered, the way most things around Malcador tend to be layered. On the most surface level, it meant he was empowered to act in the Emperor's name, to speak with the Emperor's full authority, to set the Emperor's seal upon edicts and commands when the Emperor himself was too occupied with the grand machinery of civilization building to handle the day-to-day realities of running an empire. The seal was both literal and symbolic. It meant that when Malcador walked into a room and opened his mouth, what you were hearing the Emperor of mankind's official word, and you acted accordingly unless you had a truly excellent reason not to. But there is a deeper meaning too. The Sigillites were an actual organization that existed long before Malcador adopted their name as his title. They were an ancient and secret group whose stated purpose was to gather, preserve, and protect the greatest artifacts of human civilization from the disasters that kept befalling it. Across the long and brutal centuries that the lore calls the Age of Strife, the age of technology's darkest successor, when humanity's interstellar empire fragmented and burned and was consumed by warp storms and civil war and the rebellion of artificial intelligences and all the other catastrophes of the far future's prehistory, and the Sigillites moved through the wreckage and collected what could be saved. Malcador was, by the time any of our stories begin, the last of them. The organization's old headquarters was, in its day, one of the most fortified sites in the Himalayan mountain range, which the people of this era call the Himalayan Mountains. A fortress in the peaks, a repository of knowledge and relics, guarded by individuals who understood that certain things must outlast the civilizations that produced them. When the Emperor eventually rose to prominence and began his great project of unifying Terra under a single banner, that fortress became the foundation upon which the imperial palace was built. The heritage of the Sigillites was literally poured into the bedrock of the most important building in human history. Malcador's age at the time of the stories we are most concerned with, the Horus Heresy and the centuries before it, is one of those facts that lands differently the more you sit with it. He states, on at least one recorded occasion, that he was precisely 6,718 years, 241 days, 11 hours, 8 minutes, and 56 seconds old at the moment of his speaking. He remembers the exact second of his birth. You can hear in that detail a mind that has been running for a very, very long time, a consciousness so disciplined and so precise that it can hold the length of its own existence with perfect clarity, even while managing the logistics of a civilization spanning the galaxy. But even that number might not be the full truth of his age, because there is another theory, one that is not exactly a theory so much as a fact. whispered by the Primarch Jagatai Khan, who claims that Malcador's true name is Malcador. The name itself is significant. In the old traditions of Earth, there is a figure called Al-Qidr, the Green One, described variously across cultures as an immortal wanderer, a being of hidden wisdom, a guardian of secret knowledge, who moves through human history, offering guidance to those who can recognize him and are humble enough to listen. He appears in deserts. He vanishes from roads. He knows things that should not be knowable. He has been at the margins of history for longer than recorded history exists. Jagatai Khan claims that this is Malcador, that beneath the robes and the staff of office and the carefully cultivated persona of the Emperor's loyal administrator, there exists a being who has walked the earth for far, far longer than 6,000 years. A perpetual, in the terminology of the Horus Heresy novels, one of the rare and extraordinary individuals born with the ability to return from death, to heal injuries that should be fatal, to endure across centuries and millennia in a way that ordinary humans simply cannot. The same category of being as the Emperor himself, in a certain sense, though at a considerably lower tier of power. If Malcador is real, then Malcador has been present for things that no living being should remember. He has seen the dark age of technology from inside it. He has watched the men of iron rise and fall. He has witnessed the first stirrings of the warp storms that would isolate humanity's scattered colonies from each other for thousands of years. And he has lived through the age of strife, not as a terrified mortal desperately trying to survive, but as something that could afford a longer perspective, something that could take the view of centuries and plan accordingly. And if Malcador committed atrocities during the Old Night, as Jagatai Khan further claims, then the man who stands at the Emperor's right hand and presents himself as the voice of reason and moderation and the conscience of the Imperium has a history darker than the official records suggest. The Emperor, it is said, erased those memories, scrubbed them from the public record. Whatever Malcador did in the darkness before the light came, those deeds are buried deep enough that only someone who knew where to look, as Horus apparently did, could find them. Yet this is the first layer of understanding that matters when you want to talk about Malcador. He is not what he presents himself as. Not a lie, exactly. The loyalty is genuine. The intelligence is real. The devotion to the project of human survival is absolute and has been tested in ways that would destroy lesser beings entirely. But the full truth of Malcador is considerably more complicated than the Emperor's loyal administrator and trusted friend. He carries more secrets than almost anyone else in the lore. He carries them with a graceful, unhurried calm that is either the product of profound wisdom or of a consciousness so old that it has moved past urgency into something approaching serenity. When he is threatened, and he is threatened more than once, including by people whose physical capabilities dwarf his own, he meets those threats without flinching. There is a moment in the Horus Heresy novels where the Primarch Lorgar, in a fit of rage, backhands Malcador hard enough to send him sailing 20 meters through the air and into solid ground. A strike like that from a Primarch would reduce a space marine to a mess of broken ceramite and pulped flesh. Malcador gets up. He gets up, dusts himself off, and continues the conversation. That is not the resilience of an ordinary old man kept alive through psychic willpower. That is something else. Something that has been absorbing the world's punishment for a very long time and has learned at a deep cellular level how to remain standing when everything pushes back. Now, with some sense of who Malcador actually is, the last sigillite, as potentially a perpetual of immense age, the second most powerful human psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor himself, a keeper of secrets so old that their origins predate recorded history, we can start to talk about what he actually did. Because the box does not exist in isolation. The box is the final expression of a life's work, and to understand what it holds, you need to understand the shape of that life. Section 3. The Emperor's Shadow. Malcador's role in the Imperium. There is a particular kind of figure that appears in the histories of great leaders, a person who stands just behind the throne, whose name appears in footnotes and administrative records, rather than on battle standards and victory monuments, and without whom the great leader in question would have accomplished approximately nothing at all. Malcador was that figure for the Emperor of Mankind, and the depth of what that means is staggering when you trace it carefully. When the Emperor first emerged as a significant force in the Unification Wars, carving the fractured warlord kingdoms of Terra into a single political entity through a combination of military genius, psychic power that had no peer, and a long-game political vision that most of his opponents simply could not comprehend, Malcador was already there. Not as a general, not as a warlord, as an advisor, as the mind who sat across the table from the most powerful being on earth and said, in a calm and thoughtful voice, "Here is what you might be overlooking." It was Malcador, in at least one account, who suggested to the Emperor that he take the title of Emperor in the first place. At that stage, the being we now call the Master of Mankind was simply the most successful of a number of powerful Terran factions competing for dominance, however vast the gap between him and the next most powerful. The word Emperor carries weight. It carries history. It carries the memory of everything that title meant across thousands of years of human civilization. From Rome to the Holy Roman Empire to the various successor states that held on to the title as civilizations rose and fell across the pre-age of technology centuries. Malcador, who had seen those civilizations, who carried their memory in his mind as something closer to personal experience than historical knowledge, understood the symbolic power of the word in a way that perhaps nobody else could. That is the kind of service Malcador provided. On not just administrative competence, though he had that in abundance, not just psychic power, though his abilities were extraordinary, he provided context. He provided the long view. He was, as he described himself on at least one occasion, the memory of humanity's past glories and past failures. His job was to remind the Emperor of what had gone wrong before, so that the same mistakes would not be repeated. He was not always listened to. That is worth noting. The Imperium that exists in the 41st millennium is, in many ways, the product of the Emperor's grand plan, deviating from its intended course. And at certain critical junctures, Malcador's counsel was not heeded, or was heeded too late. The relationship between these two extraordinarily powerful beings was not one of perfect alignment. There were disagreements. There were moments when Malcador said one thing and the Emperor did another, and the consequences fell out accordingly. But through all of it, the fundamental partnership endured. Malcador stayed. As the Emperor turned his attention outward toward the Great Crusade that would send the newly designed Space Marine legions out into the galaxy to reclaim humanity's scattered worlds from Xenos and warlords and the long dark of the Age of Strife, the day-to-day running of Terra and its growing empire fell increasingly to Malcador. He was titled Imperial Regent, the First Lord of Terra, the Emperor's official representative in all matters when the Emperor was otherwise engaged, which as the Crusade expanded became more and more common. The Crusade required the Emperor's direct attention on a level that made the administration of a galaxy-spanning empire something that needed to be delegated. Malcador built the Adeptus Administratum, the vast bureaucratic apparatus that manages the Imperium's material affairs across 1 million worlds. Think about what it takes to run a civilization of that scale: tax collection, population management, resource distribution across a galaxy where interstellar travel takes months or years, military logistics, judicial administration, the recording and archiving of 10,000 years' worth of history, law, precedent, and procedure. The Administratum is, in many ways, the least glamorous institution in a setting that includes psychic knights, mechanical gods, and the literal remnant of a divine emperor hanging between life and death in a golden machine. But without it, nothing functions. Malcador built it. He built the Officio Assassinorum too, the organization of imperial assassins, those extraordinary individuals trained from childhood to eliminate specific targets with absolute precision and plausible deniability, did not emerge fully formed from the ether. It was designed. It was staffed. It was given resources and infrastructure and a chain of command and a code of conduct that allowed it to operate as a weapon the Imperium could deploy against its enemies without the messy complications of open warfare. Malcador was its first Grand Master, a fact that most Inquisitors would find deeply uncomfortable if they ever sat down to trace the full institutional lineage of their secret police apparatus back to its roots. There is a story in the Horus Heresy novels about Malcador and a dying servant, and it is one of the most quietly devastating passages in the entire series. The servant is dying, and Malcador offers a comfort, a small piece of reassurance about the nature of the Emperor's plan and the destiny of humanity. And then, in what might be the most honest moment in all of his recorded speech, Malcador acknowledges that the comfort was a lie. That he said it because the dying deserved gentle words, not because it was true. That the real plan, the plan that he and the Emperor had been pursuing for longer than most civilizations have existed, was considerably darker and more complicated than any reassuring narrative about destiny and divine purpose could capture. This is Malcador in miniature, the warm, grandfatherly old man who gives comfort to the dying while internally cataloguing the necessity of their deaths as part of a larger calculation. The kindly advisor who can look a Primarch in the eye and speak words of encouragement while simultaneously planning operations that will use that same Primarch as a piece on a board game whose rules the Primarch will never fully understand. He is not cruel. The warmth is real. The care is genuine. But the calculation is always running, underneath everything, and Malcador is always thinking at least 3 moves further ahead than whoever he is speaking to. His relationship with the Primarchs is fascinating in this light. They called him grandfather, not officially, not in any formal sense, but in the way that soldiers call a respected and ancient figure by a familial title that acknowledges both affection and the vast distance of experience between them. He knew them before many of them were fully formed as individuals. He watched them arrive, one by one, from the scattered worlds where fate and the chaos gods had flung them as infants. He counseled them. He argued with them. He occasionally manipulated them in ways they did not entirely perceive, for reasons he judged to be in the long-term interest of the project that both he and the Emperor had devoted themselves to. And he outlived most of them. That is the weight he carried into the final days of the Horus Heresy. He had watched the Primarchs become legends, yet he had watched some of those legends turn traitor and begin the work of unraveling everything that had been built over centuries of effort. And he continued. He planned. He built contingencies. He prepared for the possibility that the grand project might not survive its current crisis in the form either he or the Emperor had originally envisioned, and he made certain arrangements to ensure that something would endure regardless. The box is one of those arrangements. But before we get there, we need to talk about the others. Section 4. The secrets he carried. Knights Errant, Inquisition, and the Grey Knights. When news of the massacre at Istvan arrived on Terra, when the scale of Horus's betrayal became undeniable, and the Emperor understood for the first time that his most beloved son had turned against everything they had built together, the immediate response was not grief, not rage, though both of those things were present beneath the surface. The immediate response was planning. Because the Horus Heresy was not just a military crisis, it was an existential threat to the very concept of the Imperium, and both the Emperor and Malcador understood, in the cold clarity of the moment, that the military response alone would not be sufficient. The hidden war, the war for the soul of the Imperium, needed soldiers of a different kind. The Emperor gave Malcador his orders. Find men and women of character, skill, and absolute unquestionable determination. Test them, train them, build from them the foundation of something new, something that would survive even if the heresy consumed everything else, something capable of fighting the kind of war that conventional armies could not fight, because conventional armies could not comprehend the enemy they were facing. What Malcador built from those instructions is, in retrospect, possibly the most consequential single act of institution building in the history of the Imperium. He began by assembling what he called the Knights Errant, a group of exceptional individuals drawn from both loyalist and traitor legions, warriors whose loyalty to the Emperor himself outweighed their loyalty to any legion, whose personal character had been proven under conditions that tested them to their absolute limits. Among them were Nathaniel Garrow, as a hero of the Death Guard who had risked everything to warn Terra of Horus's betrayal; Garviel Loken, a former captain of the Lunar Wolves who had been left for dead on Istvan III and recovered from a madness that would have shattered lesser men; Tylos Rubio, a former ultramarine who had defied the Edict of Nicaea, who had used his psychic gifts in open battle because the alternative was watching his brothers die, and who carried the guilt and the power of that choice with him everywhere he went; and others, each carrying their own stories of survival and loss and quiet, devastating loyalty to something they believed in more than they believed in their own continued existence. Malcador shaped these individuals. He assigned them missions that the official hierarchy of the Imperium could not carry out. That he sent them into places where open military force would have been politically impossible or tactically disastrous. He used them as scalpels where the legions were hammers, as precisely targeted interventions in situations where the wrong blunt force response would create worse problems than it solved. The Knights Errant were answerable only to Malcador, and through him to the Emperor, outside the chain of command, outside the politics of the great legions, operating in the shadows of a war that was transforming the galaxy. From the Knights Errant, two distinct but related institutions eventually emerged. The first was the Imperial Inquisition. From the earliest days of the heresy, Malcador understood that the betrayal of so many Primarchs and so many legions meant that the military structure of the Imperium could never again be trusted as the sole safeguard against internal corruption. Something else was needed, something that could investigate heresy from within, that had the authority to look at any level of imperial society, military or civilian, and ask hard questions, and, if the answers were wrong, act accordingly. 4 of the 12 individuals Malcador eventually gathered as his chosen representatives were not Space Marines at all. They were human lords and administrators, people of penetrating intelligence and unyielding moral character. And Malcador set them the task of building the framework for what would become the most feared institution in the Imperium's history. These 4 went back to Terra. They laid the groundwork. They built the organizational structure, the legal frameworks, the methods of recruitment and training and investigation that would define the Inquisition's operation for the next 10,000 years. They did not live to see the full flowering of what they had planted, most of them, but the seeds they sowed are still growing in the 41st millennium, and every Inquisitor who burns a heretic or interrogates a psyker or disappears into the shadows to follow a thread of suspicion is, at some remove, doing exactly what Malcador trained those first 4 individuals to do. The second institution that emerged from Malcador's chosen 12 is considerably more extraordinary. The other 8 were Space Marines, drawn from various legions, are unified by 2 characteristics above all others: absolute proven loyalty to the Emperor himself rather than to any legion or Primarch, and psychic ability of exceptional strength and stability. These were men who could touch the warp and not be consumed by it, who could stand in the presence of demonic entities and retain their selfhood, who possessed the psychic gifts that the Council of Nicaea had tried to suppress and ban, but which the coming war against the forces of chaos had made unavoidably essential. Malcador took these 8 to Saturn's moon Titan. He brought them to a fortress monastery that had been quietly under construction for years, its existence hidden from every official imperial record, its supply chain disguised under a classified shipping code called Othris. Was a fortress built for a purpose that had not yet fully arrived, stocked with resources and recruits, and gene seed drawn from an extraordinary source. and he told them what they were going to be. They were going to be the Emperor's ultimate weapon against chaos. Not the weapon you deploy when you can deploy something else. The weapon you keep in reserve for the kind of fight that no other weapon can win. A brotherhood of space marines created from the Emperor's own genetic blueprint, bearing gene seed drawn directly from the master of mankind himself, rather than from any of the flawed and potentially compromised Primarch lines. Psychers, all of them, trained not to suppress their abilities, but to weaponize them in ways that demonic entities specifically could not endure, pure in a way that could be measured, verifiable, tested. Heed the Grey Knights. Their names, the original 8 Grand Masters who would form the foundation of the chapter, are remembered in the lore by the names they took at Malcador's instruction rather than their birth names. Janus, Epimetheus, Chiron, Koios, Ogun, Iapto, Jotun, Satre, the names of titans from the old myths of ancient terror, which was perhaps Malcador's particular kind of poetry. They were being set the task of becoming the titans of a new age. Malcador appointed Janus as the first supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights. He set the chapter's purpose, its methods, its ethos of absolute purity and total commitment to the war against demons. He explained what they were for, and then he performed the most remarkable single act of his extraordinarily remarkable career, and one that cost him an enormous amount of the psychic reserves he would desperately need in the weeks that followed. He hid Titan from the galaxy, not with technology, not with camouflage, not with the kind of stealth that could be stripped away by sufficiently determined investigation. He wrapped the entire moon in a bubble of psychic reality and sent it into the warp itself, the immaterial dimension that exists beneath and alongside the material universe and serves as both the medium for faster-than-light travel and the habitat of the Chaos Gods and all their demonic servants. He hid the Grey Knights where Horus and his forces could never find them, because a demonically corrupted war master who understood exactly what was being built on Titan would have committed everything at his disposal to preventing it from coming to fruition. The Titan vanished. It would not return for years of real space-time. And while it was gone, something extraordinary happened, something that even Malcador, who had planned nearly everything else with meticulous precision, could only have hoped for rather than guaranteed. In the warp, time moves differently. What was years in real space became decades inside the bubble that contained Titan. And in those decades, the 8 original Grand Masters trained the hundreds of thousands of raw recruits who had been gathered for them. Gene seed was implanted. Warriors were forged. A full chapter of 1,000 battle brothers emerged from Titan's warp-touched years, ready and trained and bound to their purpose, when the moon finally returned to real space during the second founding. The Grey Knights entered their existence as they intended to continue, in secret, known only to the highest reaches of the Inquisition. Their chapter number in the second founding lists recorded as Chapter 666, a designation assigned at a point when only around 400 chapters had actually been commissioned. The number was placed there deliberately by the same human lords Malcador had originally recruited, now serving as the architects of the nascent Inquisition. A silent acknowledgement that the Grey Knights occupied a special category, set apart from all the others. Chapter 666 in a list of chapters that at the time had not yet reached 2/3 of that number. Every Grey Knight wears Malcador's sigil, acid-etched into their left gauntlet and tattooed into the flesh beneath. The mark is permanent and total. They carry it in their armor and in their skin. It is both a reminder of their origin and a commitment to their purpose. They are Malcador's children in the most meaningful sense, the final expression of the last Sigillite's belief that humanity could be protected from the worst things that existence had to offer if the right weapons were placed in the right hands. And in the deepest, most protected chamber of their fortress monastery on Titan, inside what the Grey Knights call the Chambers of Purity, in a room said to hold the tomb of Malcador himself, there is the box. Section 5. Titan, and the hidden chapter. To really understand the weight of the box and why it has never been opened. Yet you need to understand what Titan is and what the Grey Knights have been for 10,000 years since Malcador sent them into the warp and then returned to Terra to die. Because the box is not just a strategic document, it is the last direct inheritance from the man who built the chapter. It is the last instruction he ever issued. And it sits in a room next to his tomb, which means every Supreme Grand Master who has ever served the Grey Knights has carried out their duties knowing that somewhere beneath their feet, Malcador the hero is either resting or watching or both. The Citadel of Titan is one of the most extraordinary structures in the Imperium, a marvel of concealed menace that announces nothing of its own existence. It rests on the shadow of Mount Anarch, and the geological formation that juts from Titan's surface like a black spire against the swirling orange atmosphere, Saturn filling a significant portion of the sky above it. The fortress is carved entirely from basalt. Its walls are thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment. Its defensive installations include macro cannons and lance turrets, and a network of missile batteries that the lore describes as among the most formidable ground-based defenses in the Sol system, exceeded only by the defenses of Terra, Mars, and the lost fortress world of Cadia. But the physical defenses are almost beside the point. Titan's real protection is the warp nexus, a star-shaped chamber at the heart of the fortress that throbs with shackled psychic power, fed by the constant chanting of 200 chapter serfs. The warp nexus was built by Malcador's direct instruction during the original construction of the fortress, and in the 10,000 years since, it has been one of the most carefully maintained artifacts on the entire moon, not merely because it is a practical tool, but because it is one of the most tangible remnants of the Sigillites' direct work. Nobody still living knows exactly how it was built, or exactly how it functions. The knowledge of how to replicate the feat that sent Titan into the warp during the Siege of Terra has been lost. The warp nexus itself exists, and it theoretically could perform that function again, but no one currently alive would dare attempt it without understanding the mechanism more thoroughly than current Grey Knight scholarship allows. Whilst the rest of the fortress is a monument to 10,000 years of absolute war against the darkest forces in the galaxy. The Librarium Demonica holds the Imperium's single greatest collection of demonological texts, the research and testimony of 10 millennia of inquisitors and Grey Knight scholars who have made it their life's work to understand the anatomy and psychology and vulnerabilities of demonic entities. These texts are dangerous in proportion to their usefulness. Some of them carry psychic contamination that can corrupt the unprepared mind simply through the act of reading. The Chambers of Purity, maintained by the Purifiers, the most spiritually austere suborder of the Grey Knights, house trophies and relics and artifacts from 100,000 campaigns, objects too dangerous to study and too powerful to simply destroy, held in stasis by the combined psychic will of some of the most gifted warriors alive. The Dead Fields are the catacombs where every Grey Knight who can be recovered after death is brought to rest. Each century of the dead occupies its own chamber, individual tombs marked by plaques and stone statues bearing the interred warriors' features. The names carved into the great basalt wall at the center of the fortress are some of the most impressive in the Imperium. Heroes who died in circumstances that would fill entire sagas of glory and sacrifice, their deeds remembered with absolute devotion by the chapter that mourns them while remaining utterly unknown to the rest of the civilization they died to protect. Within the Dead Fields lies the Tomb of the Eight, where the original founding Grandmasters rest, and beyond that, deeper still, in the chamber within the Chambers of Purity where the box resides, is the place said to hold Malcador's own tomb. Said to hold. That phrasing matters. The Warhammer 40,000 lore is careful, as it often is around its most significant mysteries, to leave a degree of uncertainty about whether the tomb in the Chambers of Purity actually contains Malcador, or whether it is simply the place where the Grey Knights have chosen to memorialize him. Malcador died on the Golden Throne. His body burned away as the Golden Throne consumed his life force. When Rogel Dawn finally brought the dying emperor back from the vengeful spirit, and the emperor was reconnected to the throne.
Okay, I want to stop here for just a second, because this is the part of the lore that genuinely gets to me every time I come back to it. Malcador doesn't have to do any of this. He's over 6,000 years old, he has already given more to the civilization than anyone could reasonably ask, and in the final hours of the worst war humanity has ever fought, he walks up those steps, sits in a machine that he knows will kill him, and holds the door shut while his oldest friend goes to face this corrupted son. No hesitation, no bargaining, he just goes. And then, with the last fragment of himself, he makes sure the Emperor can wake up one more time to give his final orders. He gives away the very last thing he has left. I find that quietly devastating every time, because there's no glory in it, no last charge, no dramatic final blow, just an old man choosing at the end of everything to still be useful. That is Malcador, and the box on Titan is the last version of that same choice, made one more time. Still planning, still protecting, even after he's gone. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
What Dawn found of Malcador was dust blowing across the floor of the Imperial throne room. There is no body to put in a tomb, technically, but the chamber exists. Whether it holds physical remains or serves as a cenotaph, a memorial to a man whose physical death produced nothing tangible enough to enshrine, the room is treated as sacred. It is the holiest place in a fortress full of holy places. The Supreme Grand Master visits it. The box rests there, in the presence of Malcador's memory, or Malcador's actual remains, depending on what you believe and how much you trust the Grey Knight's own records about their chapter's most guarded secrets. And across 10,000 years, the chapter has produced a succession of Supreme Grand Masters, each one passing the knowledge of the box's existence to their successor before the transfer of authority is complete. This transmission of knowledge is one of the most significant rituals in Grey Knight tradition, because it carries with it an enormous weight. The new Supreme Grand Master is not merely being told that the box exists. They are being loaded with a responsibility that no other being in the Imperium carries. They alone know. They alone must judge. They alone must decide, at some unspecified future moment, whether the circumstances they observe are dire enough to justify the act of opening it. And if they die before making that decision, they must ensure the knowledge passes on. Because the box cannot be left without a guardian. Because whatever it contains is not inert. It is not a historical curiosity. It is a functional instruction waiting to be carried out. A command from a man who died 10,000 years ago that has been preserved with extraordinary care because both the man who wrote it and the chapter he created to carry it judged that there might come a moment when humanity would need it. Section 6. The Sacrifice. Malcador on the Golden Throne. Before we talk about the box's contents, we need to dwell for a moment on the circumstances under which it was left behind. Because the box was not Malcador's only legacy. It was not even his primary one. His primary legacy was what he did in the final days of the Siege of Terra, and what he did there is one of the most devastating acts of selfless sacrifice, in a setting that contains no shortage of devastating acts of selfless sacrifice. The Siege of Terra was the Horus Heresy's final movement, and the moment when everything the traitor Primarchs and their corrupted legions had been building toward for years finally arrived at the doorstep of civilization itself. Horus had brought his forces to the Sol system. Terra was under attack from a fleet so vast that it darkened the space around the planet. The Imperial Palace, that sprawling continent-spanning edifice that had once been the headquarters of humanity's greatest civilization-building project, was under direct assault by forces that brought demons alongside their soldiers, entities of the warp materializing in the corridors of the most fortified building in the galaxy. The Emperor had a problem. He could not leave the Golden Throne. This requires some explanation, because the Golden Throne is not, or at least was not originally, a life support machine. Well, it was something else entirely. The Emperor's greatest technological project. a mechanism built from recovered artifacts of the Dark Age of technology and the Emperor's own incomparable engineering genius, designed to function as a bridge between the material universe and the webway, that extraordinary network of interdimensional passages created by the ancient Aeldari that allows travel across the galaxy without exposure to the raw warp. The Emperor had intended to give humanity access to the webway, to free his species from dependence on navigators and the dangerous unpredictability of warp travel. He had been building that bridge, secretly, beneath the Imperial Palace, for years, while the Great Crusade proceeded above him. Magnus the Red destroyed that project, in an act of catastrophic well-intentioned miscalculation, and the Crimson King broke through the Emperor's psychic wards to warn him of Horus's treachery, and the force of his intrusion shattered the protections that kept the webway bridge sealed against demonic incursion. Suddenly, the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace were connected to the warp, and demons were flooding through. The Emperor was forced to take his place on the Golden Throne and pour every ounce of his psychic power into sealing the breach and fighting back the demonic tide from within. He could not leave. The moment he left, the wards would fail and Terra itself would be consumed. This is what made Horus's invasion strategy, infuriating as it was, also tactically quite elegant in its horror. The Emperor was pinned. Earth, the most powerful being in the galaxy, was occupied fighting a psychic battle in the depths of his own palace, while his planet burned above him, and his sons fought each other in the ruins of everything they had built together. And then Horus came to Terra personally, not to win the siege through attrition, not to wait it out until the defenders were too few to continue, to end it directly by forcing the confrontation that the entire heresy had been designed to produce. The Emperor needed to face Horus. That much was clear to everyone, because Horus was empowered by the Chaos Gods in ways that no ordinary force of arms could match, and the only being with a realistic chance of stopping him was the Emperor himself. But the Emperor could not leave the Golden Throne. Someone else had to take his place. Someone with psychic power, on a scale capable of maintaining the wards, of holding back the demonic tide for long enough to allow the Emperor to reach the vengeful spirit and confront his son. The original plan had been for that someone to be Magnus the Red, who was, before his corruption and defection, the second most powerful psyker in the galaxy. But Magnus had chosen Horus's side, or been maneuvered into it by the ruinous powers, and Magnus was no longer available. There was one other person. Malcador stepped forward. He did it with full knowledge of what it would cost him. He was not unaware of the math. Even the Emperor, with all his power, had been strained to exhaustion by the demands of the Golden Throne. Malcador, whose psychic gifts were extraordinary by any human measure, but considerably less than the Emperor's, he would be consumed. There was no version of this where he survived. The machine would drain everything he had and then take what was left, because the demonic pressure on the other side of those wards was not something that could be held indefinitely by anything less than the Emperor himself. And Malcador was not the Emperor. He knew this. He went anyway. There is a description in Dan Abnett's novel, The End and the Death, of what happened as Malcador prepared to take the Golden Throne. Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn helped him up the steps of the dais, knowing that he would never walk back down. The second most powerful human psyker in the history of the galaxy, in this moment, moved with the genuine frailty of an old man who has been pretending at that frailty for a very long time and has finally found the pretense catching up to him. His legs were genuinely giving way. The weight of what he was about to do was not abstract to him. He could feel it waiting for him at the top of those steps. The Emperor and Malcador had a final psychic conversation as the transfer was made. What passed between them in that exchange is not recorded in the official lore, because some things are genuinely too private to be shared, even in a fictional universe that contains as many revelations as this one. But the Emperor stood when Malcador sat. And as he stood, he looked at his oldest friend and said words that were both a farewell and a tribute. The man who had been Malcador the Sigillite, the Seal-Bearer, the First Lord of Terror, the architect of half the institutions that kept the Imperium running, would henceforth be known as Malcador the hero. But the campaign was his greatest act and his last. He held the throne while the Emperor and a small party that included Rogel Dawn and Sanguinius made their way to the vengeful spirit, while Horus and the Emperor fought their final confrontation in a duel that ended the Horus heresy in the most Pyrrhic way imaginable. When Rogel Dawn brought the Emperor back, broken nearly beyond repair, the exchange was made once more. Malcador, by this point barely recognizable as a living thing, used the very last of his life force to pass something to the Emperor. One final gift, a kernel of psychic strength drawn from the deepest reserves of a consciousness that had been running for thousands of years, saved for this specific moment with a precision that only Malcador could have managed. That gift was the reason the Emperor could wake from his coma long enough to give Rogel Dawn his final instructions before being interred in the Golden Throne forever. Everything that followed from those instructions, the second founding, the Codex Astartes, the shape of the Imperium's next 10,000 years, came from a choice that Malcador made to hold on to the very last of himself until it could be given away for the best possible purpose. When the Golden Throne's tech priests made the final disconnection, the last flicker of consciousness left Malcador's frame, and the dust of his corpse blew across the stone floor. The Emperor named him Hero, and the name held, and the box remained on Titan, waiting for the moment its instructions would be needed. Section 7, the box itself, the Terminus decree and what it is. Now we arrive at the heart of it, the wooden box in the chambers of purity on Titan, the Terminus decree. The lore around the Terminus decree has been part of Warhammer 40,000 since 2011, when it first appeared in the 5th edition Codex, Grey Knights. Since that first appearance, it has been one of the most frequently discussed mysteries in the entire setting, a piece of lore so deliciously constructed that it generated debates and theories for over a decade before Games Workshop finally decided to reveal its contents in the 10th edition Codex. Grey Knights, published in 2024 and reaching the community in mid-2025. Let us start with what we knew for all those years before the reveal. Because the way the mystery was constructed tells you almost as much about the Warhammer 40,000 setting's values and priorities as the reveal itself does. The original description from the 5th edition Codex was spare and careful. Deep within the Chambers of Purity, within the Grey Knights' fortress monastery on Titan, locked away in the chamber, said to hold the tomb of Malcador the Sigillite himself, rests a simple wooden box, embellished with a golden seal. Within this box is the ancient parchment that contains the instructions known only as the Terminus decree. Only a supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights knows how to open the box, and he will do so only when all hope for the future of humanity seems lost. And then the payoff line, the one that landed with genuine weight and stayed there across 10 years of debate. While the exact nature of the document is unknown, and the only clue to its contents lies in the box's golden seal. It is whispered that it is the exact match of another seal, found only in one place in all the Imperium of man's many scattered worlds, within the Imperial Palace, upon the Emperor's golden throne. Think about everything that single detail does. It does not tell you what the decree says. It does not hint at whether the decree is a salvation or a doom. What it tells you is that whatever is written on that parchment has a direct connection to the Emperor himself, the same seal that the Emperor used on the box, the same seal that sits on the most sacred and terrible and consequential piece of architecture in human history. The box and the throne are linked. The instruction inside the box is linked to the throne. Now, what that means is left, deliberately and beautifully, to the imagination. The prohibition on opening the box is absolute and layered. The existence of the box is known to exactly one person, the Supreme Grand Master, at any given time. There is no record of it in any library in the material realm, which is an extraordinary claim in a setting where the Administratum maintains archives sophisticated enough to track births and deaths across 1 million worlds and the Inquisition has been collecting forbidden knowledge for 10,000 years. This is a piece of information that has been kept so clean that it exists only in the living memory of a single individual, passed from one supreme Grand Master to the next in a chain of whispered confidence that has held without a single leak for 100 centuries. It will be opened only when all hope for the future of humanity seems lost. Not when things are very bad. Not when things are catastrophic in ways that would qualify for that description in ordinary language. When all hope seems lost. The criteria are deliberately maximal. The seal on that box is the seal of final resort, of last-ditch sanity, of the acknowledgement that the moment for it has arrived, only when no other option exists and no other calculation makes sense. The very act of opening it is, in itself, an admission that the situation is beyond recovery by any other means. For 10,000 years, across events that shook the galaxy to its foundations, the box has remained closed. The War of the Beast saw the Imperium come closer to total collapse than at any point since the Horus Heresy, what with a single Orc warlord commanding forces of such scale that they threatened terror itself. The age of apostasy nearly tore the Imperium apart from within, religious civil war consuming whole sectors. The 13th Black Crusade ended with the fall of Cadia, the fortress world that had guarded the Eye of Terror for thousands of years, its loss triggering the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, a wound in space and reality that tore the galaxy in half and plunged half the Imperium into Noctis Eterna, a period of total warp storm isolation and darkness. None of that was enough. None of those crises met the threshold. The box remained closed. In the years following the formation of the Great Rift, the 10th edition lore places the Grey Knight's Supreme Grand Master, Kaldor Drygo, in an interesting position. Or rather, in no position at all, since Drygo has been trapped in the warp, fighting an endless personal war since before the Rift formed. His seat at the council table of the Grand Masters is described as always empty, a permanent memorial to an absence. The Grey Knights have continued to function in his absence, as the chapter's structure allows for collective leadership by the remaining Grand Masters when the Supreme Grand Master is unavailable. But the question of who holds the knowledge of the Terminus decree when the designated holder is lost in the warp is one that the lore has not fully addressed. It is not a small question. It is the kind of structural problem that could, under the wrong circumstances, result in the box becoming inaccessible at exactly the moment it would need to be opened. But all of this, the elaborate architecture of secrecy and responsibility and threshold conditions, was secondary to the question that everyone really wanted answered. What does it say? Section 8. 10,000 years of waiting. Before we get to the reveal, let us sit for a moment in the experience of the 10,000 years during which nobody opened the box. Because that span of time is its own kind of story, and it is important context for understanding what the reveal means. 10,000 years is not a number that human intuition is particularly well equipped to process. It is so large that it functionally stops being a number and becomes a concept, a way of gesturing at duration without actually inhabiting it. For perspective, 10,000 years ago in actual Earth history, human civilization had not yet developed writing. The oldest surviving continuously inhabited cities on Earth were barely beginning their existence as permanent settlements. Agriculture was new, metalworking was new. The idea of a king, a state, a society organized around anything more complex than small tribal communities was, in many places, still theoretical. The Roman Empire, which most people in the Western world think of as a very long time ago, ended in its Western form roughly 1,500 years before the present day, and in its Eastern form a little over 500 years before. The Roman Empire falls entirely within the most recent 15% of the span we are talking about. 10,000 years is the entire history of human organized civilization, compressed into a single measure of time, and then treated as the duration between 2 points in a fictional future history. The Grey Knights have been keeping the secret of the box for that entire span. The chain of Supreme Grand Masters, each one carrying the knowledge alone, has held without a break. The chapter itself has fought continuously for that entire period, waging the secret war against demonic incursion and chaos corruption that Malcador and the Emperor designed them to fight. They have lost brothers in uncountable numbers. They have faced threats that would have broken any less carefully constructed organization. They have operated in a setting where the political structure of the Imperium has shifted dramatically multiple times, where the definition of heresy has expanded and contracted and been weaponized by competing factions, where the Inquisition that nominally oversees them has gone through purges and schisms and entire institutional revolutions. Through all of it, the box has sat in its chamber and the secret has held. This is, when you think about it, one of the most remarkable achievements of institutional design in the history of fictional civilizations. The information has not leaked. Not once. Not through the War of the Beast, when the Imperium was so consumed by the emergency that entire institutional structures collapsed under the pressure of the crisis. Not through the Age of Apostasy, when the Inquisition itself was consumed by the kind of internal warfare that tends to produce revelations and purges and the kinds of desperate bargaining that expose the deepest secrets of the parties involved. Not through the 13th Black Crusade, when Abaddon the Despoiler was pressing the most serious military advantage the forces of chaos had achieved in thousands of years, and the Imperium was deploying every resource at its disposal in response. There is something almost meditative about imagining the box sitting there through all of that, the galaxy shrieking with the noise of war and politics and catastrophe, and in the chambers of purity on Titan, the cold hum of the fortress and the chanting of the chapter serfs maintaining the wards, and in the deepest chamber, perfect silence. The box, the seal, the parchment inside, undisturbed. In the discussions that followed the Great Rift's formation, in the later 8th and 9th edition lore, the question of whether the Terminus decree's threshold had been met began to be raised explicitly within the narrative. Or the Great Rift had done something that no previous crisis had quite managed. It had physically and persistently divided the Imperium, cutting communication and supply lines, plunging entire sectors into darkness, demonstrating in a material and ongoing way that the galaxy itself had been wounded in a manner that previous catastrophes had not managed. Kaldor Drygo, in some accounts, was said to be among those considering reading the Terminus decree in the wake of the Rift's formation. The conversation was happening, at least, but even the Great Rift was not, in the narrative, enough. Guilliman returned. The Indomitus Crusade launched. The Primarch Regent of the Imperium, the tactical and administrative genius of the Ultramarines, yet the man who wrote the Codex Astartes and built the organizational framework that the Imperium had relied upon for 10,000 years, was back. Things were still terrible. They were perhaps the worst they had been since the Horus Heresy in some respects. But they were not the absolute terminal endpoint that the Terminus Decree's threshold described. The box remained closed. And what the Grey Knights experienced during those 10,000 years, what the weight of that responsibility did to the successive Supreme Grand Masters who carried it, is something the lore touches on only obliquely. The knowledge that you alone know the thing, that you are the only person alive who could act on it, that the threshold for action is so extreme that it has not been reached in 10,000 years of documented history, that your predecessor looked at the worst things they ever witnessed and concluded, not yet, not this, not enough. What does that do to a mind? What does it feel like to carry that specific weight? To stand in the chambers of purity and look at the box and know that you could open it and know that you should not. To be the sole keeper of the last instruction of Malcador the Hero, in a chapter that was built by Malcador the Hero, in a fortress that is itself a monument to Malcador the Hero's vision, and to understand that your entire purpose, in one particular and very specific dimension, is to wait. The Grey Knights do not speak of this. The Grey Knights, as a rule, do not speak of most things. But the box is there, and the seal is there, and the weight is there, and every Supreme Grand Master who has ever lived has carried it alone. Section 9. What was revealed? The 10th edition answer. And then, in the summer of 2025, Games Workshop put the Terminus decree into the 10th edition codex. Grey Knights. A sidebar, not even a full page. A contained, deliberate, precise piece of law that answered the question everyone had been asking for 14 years. The Emperor of mankind, the decree states, can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, under any circumstances, in any form, whether he is returned to life through some mechanism of healing or recovery, whether he is reborn in another body, through some process of metempsychosis or psychic transfer, or the mysterious workings of whatever he has been becoming in the 10,000 years of near death on the throne, whether he ascends as some kind of warp entity, a god born from the faith and the psychic energy that 10,000 years of devotion have poured into the throne from every corner of the Imperium. If any of those things happen, the decree says, the Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty, by whatever means are necessary, against whatever opposition stands in their way, including, explicitly, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own golden-armoured personal guard, 10,000-year veterans of their own sacred duty, possibly the most individually powerful soldiers in the Imperium of man. If the Emperor tries to leave, the Grey Knights must stop him. If the Emperor comes back to life, the Grey Knights must put him back. If the Emperor ascends to godhood, the Grey Knights must force a god back into a machine. And there are, the decree notes, no instructions for how this should be done. The most powerful demon hunters in the Imperium, an entire chapter of psycho warriors bearing gene seed drawn from the Emperor himself, are given an absolute command to perform an act of potentially impossible magnitude, and then explicitly told to figure out the method themselves. The community response to this revelation was, shall we say, energetic. The lore forums and community spaces that follow Warhammer 40,000 erupted in the immediate aftermath, a response that split fairly cleanly between two camps. The first camp found it brilliantly constructed, as a piece of lore that explained the mystery while simultaneously opening an entirely new set of questions and threading the revelation into existing lore threads in ways that had enormous implications for where the overarching story might be going. The second camp found it deeply unsatisfying, arguing that the mystery was more valuable than the answer, that the imagination the sealed box had provoked for 14 years was richer and more interesting than the specific thing Games Workshop chose to put in it. Both responses are reasonable. The setting lives on mystery, and resolving mysteries is always a risky business, because the thing you imagine something to be is almost inevitably more perfectly tailored to your own sense of drama than the thing an author actually writes. The community's theories about the Terminus decree had, over 14 years, ranged from the wildly cosmic to the chillingly practical. Some theorized it was a method of resurrecting the Emperor, a final secret path back from the death that isn't death that he has been enduring on the throne. Others thought it was a bioweapon capable of killing every transhuman in the galaxy, the ultimate failsafe against a space marine rebellion. The nightmare scenario that the Horus heresy had demonstrated was a genuine possibility. Still others thought it was a set of coordinates for some ancient weapon or technology from the dark age of technology that could, in theory, end the threat of chaos permanently. What it actually turned out to be was, in its own way, darker than most of the theories. Because the theories mostly imagined the Terminus decree as a path towards some kind of victory or resolution. The actual decree is an instruction against resolution. It is the Emperor, through Malcador, saying, whatever else happens, I must stay on the throne, not because the throne is where victory lives, but because the alternative to the throne is something worse. Section 10. The Dark King, Beneath the Surface. To understand why the Emperor issued that instruction, why the contingency of the Emperor leaving the throne, in any form, is treated in the decree as something worse than the current state of desperate stagnation, you need to go back to the Horus Heresy series and one of its most extraordinary revelations. One that arrived in the final volumes of that decades-long publishing project. The Emperor, during the Siege of Terror, nearly became a chaos god. Not metaphorically, not as a theological position held by his enemies, literally. In the physical and metaphysical mechanics of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where the Chaos Gods are genuinely real entities formed from the collective psychic energy of mortal minds, the Emperor came within a heartbeat of ascending to that category. The mechanism is elegant in its horror. The Chaos Gods are not arbitrary. They do not emerge from nothing. They are the accumulated reflection of mortal emotion and mortal experience, shaped over billions of years by the aggregate psychic output of every thinking creature in the galaxy. Khorne rose from violence and blood, Nurgle from despair and decay, Tzeentch from ambition and scheming, Slaanesh from desire and excess, born from the fall of the Eldar, in a moment of civilizational catastrophe so intense that it tore a hole in physical reality. The same process had been building around the Emperor for a very long time. Not from love, precisely, though the worship of countless billions contributes to the build-up. From something else, from the dark reflection of what the Emperor represented, a force of merciless order, of absolute judgment, of a rationality that would consume everything in service to its own vision of what must be. The prophesied fifth Chaos God, given the name the Dark King in ancient prophecies, was destined to be born from humanity's suffering and humanity's trauma, and the twisting of the Emperor's own nature into its darkest possible reflection. During the Siege of Terror, in the moments before the final confrontation with Horus, the Emperor drew on the warp to empower himself. He drew on it at a scale that had never been attempted before, drinking in psychic energy at a rate that began to transform him. He was, in the terms of the narrative, ascending, becoming something that could meet Horus's Chaos God-granted power at its own level. And in doing so, he was crossing the threshold into the Dark King's territory. He was becoming the thing that prophecy had said would come. He was talked back from the edge. Olanius Person, one of the Perpetuals, a man who had known the Emperor in a life so distant in human prehistory that the memory of it was essentially mythological, encountered him in that moment of transformation and reminded him of his humanity, of the choice that existed, of the possibility of stepping back from the abyss, of refusing the power that had been offered and fighting Horus on terms that might not be sufficient, as himself rather than as the monster he was becoming. The Emperor stepped back. He gave up the power. He set aside the Dark King's potential, shedding the parts of his soul that he judged could not coexist with the decision he had to make. That shed portion, the fragment of the Emperor's consciousness that held his capacity for love and hope, and compassion and mercy, drifted free of him. It entered the warp as a separate entity. In older lore, this fragment had another name, the Star Child, but in the most recent heresy novels, it is described as something like a seed of light, growing slowly in the void, gathering itself towards some future purpose that has not yet been fully defined. The Emperor saved himself from becoming the Dark King in that moment. But the prophecy was not destroyed. The Dark King's potential was deferred, or not eliminated. The ruinous powers, whose relationship with time is not linear in the way mortal relationships with time are, understand that time flows differently in the warp. The Dark King's servants exist. The Dark King's domain exists. The birth was delayed, but the birth was not prevented, not permanently, not in a way that closes the possibility. And the Emperor on the Golden Throne has been accumulating energy for 10,000 years, fed by the psychic death of 1,000 psychers every single day, fueled by the collective faith of hundreds of billions of worshippers who have been treating him as a literal god for 10 millennia. The being on the throne is changing, has been changing, is not what it was when it was first interred. In the 41st millennium, something stirs behind the Emperor's vacant eyes that was not there before. Saints perform miracles. Visions fill the corridors of the palace. The Astronomicon blazes brighter at certain moments than physics alone could explain. Something is happening on the throne that no one fully understands. If the Emperor were to leave the throne, in whatever form that leaving took, the question the Terminus decree implicitly forces is, what would emerge? Would it be the Emperor as he was? The ambitious rationalist who built the Great Crusade and devised the imperial truth and thought that suppressing religion was the most efficient path to human flourishing. That individual has been gone for 10,000 years, has been absorbed into the Golden Throne's functions, has been fed on worship and death and the concentrated emotion of a civilization using him as its defining spiritual object. The being that might emerge from the throne might bear the emperor's memories and something of his personality, but it would not be the same entity that went in. Would it be the Dark King? If the threshold conditions are right, if 10,000 years of psychic accumulation have built up enough of the dark potential that was deferred at the Siege of Terror, then the emergence from the throne might not be a resurrection. It might be a birth. And the birth of a fifth Chaos God would make every previous disaster in the setting look like a minor inconvenience. Would it be something else entirely? A warp entity that is neither the Emperor of Legend nor the Dark King of Prophecy, but something new, shaped by 10,000 years of being a focus of human belief and human sacrifice and human hope. Something that incorporates all of that into a consciousness that cannot be fully predicted from anything that existed before. The Terminus decree, in its revealed form, does not answer these questions. It does not need to. What it says is, whatever emerges, it goes back. The Grey Knights will put it back. Because whatever emerges will not be the Emperor, not in any form that can be trusted to behave as the Emperor would behave, and the risks of allowing whatever it has become to operate freely in the galaxy are categorically unacceptable. The Emperor wrote his own imprisonment order, or Malcador wrote it for him, which in the context of their relationship is close enough to the same thing. Whatever the Emperor becomes, however the transformation resolves, the Grey Knights are the fail-safe against the emergence. They will fight the Custodes, they will fight the Ecclesiarchy, they will fight anyone who stands between them and the reinterment of whatever comes off that throne. They will do it with no instructions for how to accomplish the impossible, with only the command that it must be done. This is the box. This is what Malcador left behind. Section 11. Why the mystery still matters. The community response to the revelation of the Terminus decree raised a question that exists for every mystery in Warhammer 40,000, and for mysteries in fiction generally. When do you answer, and what do you risk by answering? Games Workshop did not arrive at this decision lightly, and the way they chose to reveal it is itself significant. Not a Black Library novel, not a major campaign book, a sidebar in a codex, a relatively brief piece of text that delivers the essential information without extensive dramatization or narrative context. The setting of the revelation is as stripped down as the wooden box it describes. Here is what the parchment says. That is all. The restraint is partly functional. The Terminus decree, if dramatized in full, would require narrative conditions in which a supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights has determined that all hope for humanity is lost. Writing that story, even in a limited context, would require either a genuine commitment to the metaplot moving toward that end point, or a kind of artificial dramatic staging that would undermine the weight the revelation deserves. Better to deliver the contents as a piece of historical lore, something we know but that exists in the setting as an unused instruction, than to frame it through a scene that the narrative consequences of which would be either enormous or hollow. But the restraint also reflects something about the Terminus decree's nature. It was always designed to be too big to fully dramatize. The threshold for opening it is the end of everything. The instruction inside it, even now that we know what it says, is so extreme in its implications that it functions better as a fact about the universe than as a plot event. The Grey Knights will fight the Emperor himself back onto his throne. That is the last instruction of Malcador the hero. It is not something that can be made into a climax of a story, because it is itself so extreme that it is a climax waiting for circumstances that have not yet arrived. But the theories the community generated over 14 years are worth reflecting on for what they reveal about how people engage with the setting's deepest mysteries. The bioweapon theory is particularly interesting. There is, in the Horus Heresy novels, a genuine reference to something called File Terminus, a piece of intelligence about a virus developed by a figure called Basilio Foe, capable of killing space marines and primarchs. This information was gathered by Malcador and passed to his chosen agents. Some community members constructed an argument that this bioweapon was the true content of the Terminus decree, the ultimate failsafe against the transhuman soldiers the Imperium had built, in case those soldiers ever turned against their creators again. The appeal of this theory is clear. It is concrete, and it is actionable in a military sense. It resolves one of the setting's persistent anxieties about the Space Marine chapters, which are essentially the Imperium's standing armies, and which the Horus Heresy demonstrated could not be assumed loyal, simply because they had been designed to be loyal. If Malcador had left a weapon capable of killing every Space Marine in the galaxy, it would be a terrifying ultimate failsafe of exactly the kind his character would suggest he would want to maintain. But it also undersells what the box actually contains, which is something more conceptually audacious than any weapon. The actual Terminus decree is not a weapon, it is a command. And the command is addressed not to an external threat, but to the most sacred figure in the entire setting. The Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty. The word terrible is doing significant work there. It does not pretend that the throne is good for the Emperor. It acknowledges that the existence he has been living for 10,000 years is something that deserves the word terrible. It is a terrible duty, and he must continue it, because the alternative is worse. There is a strand of thought in the community, and it is one that rewards attention, that sees the Terminus decree as the most honest thing in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. In a universe where the Imperium's propaganda presents the Emperor's life on the throne as sacred and glorious, where 10,000 years of religion have transformed his dying into an act of ongoing divine protection, where the complexity of what is actually happening in that room beneath the Imperial Palace is hidden from essentially everyone who is not at the very highest level of understanding, the Terminus decree says plainly, this is terrible, it must continue, and it is the Grey Knight's job to make sure it does. That is not comfort. That is not hope. That is the unsentimental recognition that the best available option for humanity is also an option that involves condemning the most important being in their history to a continued existence that the Emperor's own sealed decree describes as terrible. Malcador, who saw more clearly than almost anyone else, and who was willing to tell those hard truths, left behind a hard truth as his last instruction. The setting's grimdark reputation is earned by moments like this one, not by the volume of the violence or the scale of the monsters, by the quiet, wooden box-sized acknowledgement that the hero of your civilization is in a condition his own allies describe as terrible, and the best you can do is make sure it stays that way, because the alternatives are worse. Section 12. The Golden Seal and the Golden Throne. A final meditation. Let us return, one last time, to the Golden Seal. The seal on the wooden box is described as matching the seal on the Golden Throne. This detail was introduced in 2011, before the contents of the decree were known, and it functions on multiple levels simultaneously in a way that careful Warhammer lore tends to reward. On the most literal level, it is authentication. It is the Emperor's own mark, thus the confirmation that whatever is written on the parchment inside the box came from the highest possible authority. No one could look at that seal and claim uncertainty about the source of the instruction. It bears the Emperor's sign, and in a civilization organized around the absolute authority of that sign, the authentication is complete and unquestionable. On a deeper level, it is continuity. The seal that sits on the box and the seal that sits on the throne are the same because the box and the throne are connected in the decree's logic. The throne is the subject of the decree. The decree exists because of the throne. The seal that marks the place of confinement and the seal that marks the instruction regarding confinement are the same because they are expressions of the same decision, the same terrible calculation, at the same choice made at the end of the world by the most powerful being humanity has ever produced. The Emperor marked the throne with his seal when he built it, before he understood what it would become. He marked the box with the same seal when he understood what the throne was going to mean for him and for humanity both. The two seals reaching toward each other across the distance between Terra and Saturn, across the 10,000 years since both were made, represent the Emperor acknowledging that he knew. He knew what was coming for him. He prepared for it. He set in place the people and the instructions and the contingencies that he judged were necessary, and then he did his duty anyway. Malcador, who carried that knowledge with him to the Golden Throne and died there. Who built the Grey Knights to serve as the guardians of that instruction, for as long as the instruction needed to wait, understood what he was doing too. He did not put the box on Titan because he thought it would never be needed. He put it there because he understood that the specific crisis it addresses might take a very long time to arrive, and he trusted the institution he had built to carry the weight of that waiting. That is, in the end, what makes the Terminus decree remarkable. Not the content of the decree itself, though that content is extraordinary enough. It is the act of preparation. Of a man who had been preparing for the long view his entire life, who had spent thousands of years watching civilizations rise and fall and learning from their failures, using the last of his power and the last of his time to set in place a contingency for a scenario that might not arrive for 1,000 years, or 10,000, or 100,000. Not because he expected to see the outcome, because someone might need to, and someone should be prepared. Malcador did not live to see what the Grey Knights became after Titan returned from the warp. He did not live to see the chapter's first campaigns, its first victories, the development of the traditions and practices, and the extraordinary culture that 10,000 years of existentially important war against the darkest forces in existence produces in a brotherhood of Psyker warrior monks. He did not live to see the Terminus decree remain unopened through every crisis that his carefully constructed institution faced and survived. He left the box, yet he set the seal. He trusted the Grey Knights, who were his final gift to the Emperor and to humanity, to carry the responsibility with the same seriousness that everything else in their design was built to carry. And they have. For 10,000 years and counting, in the cold and the silence beneath Titan's surface, where the only light is the faint glow of the warding inscriptions and the echo of chapter serfs' prayers bouncing off basalt walls, the box waits, patient, sealed, bearing its golden mark in the chamber next to the tomb of the man who left it there. The day it is opened, the galaxy will already be at the end of something. The decree says so, in its own quiet way. The threshold is not reached until the final calculation has been run and the final answer has come back wrong. Until that day, as the Supreme Grand Master carries the weight of knowing, carries the specific knowledge that there exists a piece of parchment in a wooden box that says the most terrible thing in the universe, which is that the best humanity can hope for is that its greatest hero keeps suffering, and that if that suffering ever ends, the Grey Knights must make it start again. That is Malcador's final legacy, the last instruction of the last sigillite, the last seal bearer, bearing the seal one more time. The box is there if you need it. You will not need it today. Conclusion. The weight of the waiting. There is something deeply Warhammer 40,000 about the fact that one of the setting's most significant mysteries resolves into an instruction that makes the situation sound even more hopeless than the mystery itself implied. That you spend 14 years wondering what could be so important that it requires this level of secrecy and this extreme threshold for activation. And the answer is, the most important being in the setting must be prevented from leaving his own terrible imprisonment, by force if necessary, because leaving would be worse than staying. And yet, within the grim-dark framework, within a setting defined by the idea that there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the Terminus decree contains something that functions almost as a kind of grim hope. The very existence of the decree means that someone thought about the future. Malcador thought about the future. He imagined circumstances that had not yet arrived, and built a response to them that could wait as long as the response needed to wait. He trusted that the institution he built, and the brotherhood of warrior monks who bear his mark in their skin, would carry that trust faithfully. They do. The box sits in its chamber, and the seal holds, and the knowledge passes from Supreme Grand Master to Supreme Grand Master like a flame carried through the dark between cupped hands, too important to extinguish, too dangerous to expose to the wind. The galaxy is burning, as it has been burning for 10,000 years. Daemon hosts press at the veil between realities. Chaos gods play their eternal games with the lives of billions. The Imperium, vast and fractured and magnificent in its terrible endurance, staggers on. And somewhere, on a hidden moon of Saturn, in a fortress of black basalt where the greatest warriors humanity has ever produced keep their endless vigil, while in a chamber that smells of cold stone and old prayer and the faint, impossible suggestion of something that was once a man and became legend, the box waits. It is not much to look at, really. A wooden box with a golden seal, dusty now perhaps, after 10,000 years. The wood darker than it was when Malcador's hands last touched it. The seal unchanged, because certain things do not change. It is a plain wooden box, and it contains the end of everything and the last best hope for the species, folded together into a piece of ancient parchment that nobody has read in 10,000 years, and that everyone hopes, for as long as hope is possible, nobody will ever have to read. That is the law. That is the box. That is Malcador, the hero's final gift to the species he gave his life to protect. And if you made it all the way to the end of this one, if you sat with me through the full depth of Malcador's story, and the history of the Grey Knights, and the 10,000 years of waiting, and the extraordinary moment when the box's secret was finally revealed, then you already know that this kind of lore is exactly what makes Warhammer 40,000 something special. Not just the bolters and the primarchs and the scale of the wars. This, the small wooden box, the single golden seal, the one person who knows, the terrible patience of an instruction that never expires. If this is the kind of deep lore dive that you come to this channel for, then you know what to do. Like the video if it helped you see the box a little more clearly. Subscribe to Q on 40K if you want more quiet, careful journeys through the darkest corridors of the grim darkness of the far future. There is no shortage of lore in this setting. There is no shortage of boxes waiting to be opened, mysteries waiting to be traced to their roots, secrets whose full weight only becomes clear when you sit down with them and take your time. Until next time, rest easy. The box is still closed, for now. Script by Q. On 40,000, research sourced from Codex, Grey Knights, 5th, 7th, and 10th editions, Warhammer 40,000, Lexicanum, the Horus Heresy novel series including The End and the Death by Dan Abnett, Bell of Lost Souls lore archives, our Warhammer community, official lore articles, extended section, The Architecture of Secrecy and Why It Held. One of the things that tends to be underappreciated when people discuss the Terminus decree is the sheer engineering involved in keeping a secret for 10,000 years in a civilization of that complexity. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting defined by information control. The Inquisition exists, in large part, precisely because information is dangerous, because what people know shapes what people believe and what they are willing to do. And the Imperium's stability has always depended at least partially on managing the flow of dangerous knowledge. The setting's most powerful institutions have spent millennia developing the architecture of secrecy. The mind-scrubbing of Imperial guardsmen who accidentally witnessed a Grey Knight's operation, the mass executions of civilian populations who saw something they were not supposed to see, the endless work of archivists and librarians devoted not to preserving knowledge, but to destroying it. And yet, even within that environment, the Terminus decree stands apart. because most of the Imperium's secrets are kept by organizations. The existence of the Grey Knights is known to the highest levels of the Inquisition, and while it is fiercely protected, it is protected by many minds and many wills and many institutional structures. The fact that the Iron Warriors betrayed the Emperor is known in broad strokes to millions of people who have read histories of the Horus heresy. The existence of the Chaos Gods, officially denied in the early centuries of the Imperium under the framework of the Imperial Truth, has been openly acknowledged by the ecclesiarchy for thousands of years. Even the most sensitive military secrets tend to be shared among the councils that need to know them. The Terminus decree is known to one person, not one organization, not one committee, one individual human being at any given moment in time who must carry that knowledge alone without the support of colleagues or advisors or a hierarchical structure that shares the burden of the information. The Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights knows, nobody else does. When a Supreme Grand Master dies in battle, or retires to the dead fields beneath Titan, or is lost in the warp in circumstances beyond anyone's control, the knowledge transfers. But only ever to one mind at a time. This is a deliberate choice, and it reflects Malcador's understanding of information security in a way that is worth dwelling on. The more people who know a secret, the more vectors exist for that secret to escape. Every additional mind that holds the information is another potential failure point. Death under circumstances where the transfer cannot be properly made. Corruption by outside forces. Simple human error in a moment of weakness or grief or distraction. Malcador, who had spent thousands of years watching the way secrets were lost, who had seen how organizations became compromised and how the most carefully guarded institutional knowledge eventually found its way to people who were not supposed to have it, made a radical design choice. He reduced the number of potential failure points to the minimum that the information's survival required. One person. Always one person. The chain of transmission long enough to reach from the Horus heresy to the end of time, but as narrow as it could possibly be made. The decision also carries an implicit statement about the nature of the Grey Knights themselves. Malcador trusted one Grandmaster at a time with this knowledge because he trusted the institution he had built to consistently produce Grandmasters worthy of that trust. He was not designing a system that would function if the individuals in it were ordinary. Where he was designing a system that would function because the individuals in it would not be ordinary, because the selection and training and testing that produced a Grey Knight Supreme Grandmaster would produce a being of sufficient caliber to carry this particular burden without breaking under it. The box is not just a piece of lore. It is a statement about what the Grey Knights are, what they have been built to be, and what the man who built them believed they were capable of. There is also something quietly devastating about the loneliness of the knowledge. In a brotherhood as close as the Grey Knights, where warriors who have fought together through some of the most horrifying encounters that the galaxy can produce have bonds of trust and understanding that most people cannot even conceptualize. The Supreme Grand Master carries one thing that nobody else shares. Not his battle brothers, not the Grand Masters of the various brotherhoods, not the prognosticars in the Augurium who have devoted their lives to reading the future in the turbulent currents of the warp, not the chaplains who know every secret of the soul that the chapter collectively holds, just the one thing held alone behind the eyes of the man at the top. The Grey Knights do not speak of weakness as a cultural practice. They are too carefully selected and too thoroughly trained to allow weakness to persist unaddressed, and the nature of their warfare against demonic entities means that any weakness of will becomes a potential entry point for the very things they fight. But there must be moments, now late in the quiet of the Cloister of Sorrows, where Grey Knights go to stand alone under the stars of Titan and collect their thoughts, where the Supreme Grand Master feels the weight of the specific thing they carry, and wonders, in the privacy of their own mind, whether the day will come, whether this generation, or the next, or the one after, will be the one that has to open the box and read what it says. For every Supreme Grand Master for 10,000 years, that day has not arrived. There is no way to know whether this represents good fortune or extraordinary collective human resilience and adaptability, or whether it reflects the fact that the threshold was always set just slightly above the worst thing that has actually happened. The Imperium has come close to collapse in ways that are genuinely staggering. The War of the Beast saw a single orc warlord commanding forces of such coordinated scale that they threatened the Sol system directly, something that had not happened since Horus's own fleet arrived above Terra. The formation of the Great Rift tore the galaxy into two halves and plunged entire sectors into a period of isolation from the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides ships through the warp. These were not minor setbacks. These were civilizational crises that genuinely threatened humanity's survival at a species level. And still, the box was not opened, which means that every Supreme Grand Master who confronted those crises looked at the situation, made their calculation, and concluded that the threshold described in the Terminus decree had not been reached. That hope still existed somewhere, and that the instruction to open the box would be premature, that the terrible patience of not opening it was still the right decision. What that means for the current state of the galaxy in the 41st millennium is a question the community has been actively debating since the formation of the Great Rift. Because if 10,000 years of crises have not been enough to open the box, but those crises keep escalating in scale and frequency and severity, then at some point, the calculation must change. At some point, the Supreme Grand Master, sitting in the chambers of purity and looking at the sealed wooden box, must decide that the moment has arrived. And when they make that decision, they will be making it in circumstances that are, by definition, worse than anything the Imperium has survived before. As extended section, Malcador's design philosophy and the long view. The Terminus decree cannot be understood in isolation from the rest of Malcador's lifework, and specifically from the way his approach to institutional design differed from the approach of nearly everyone else involved in the founding of the Imperium. Most of the institutions that shaped the early Imperium were designed to solve immediate problems. The Thunder Warriors were designed to win the Unification Wars. The Space Marine Legions were designed to win the Great Crusade. Even the Primarchs themselves, those extraordinary genetic masterworks, who were the Emperor's greatest engineering achievement, were designed to solve the military problem of reclaiming a galaxy's worth of lost human worlds from Xenos occupation and warlord dominion. Malcador, almost uniquely, or designed for the very long term. The Administratum was built to manage governance across a scale that no human institution had ever attempted, but it was built with redundancy and adaptability built into its structure in ways that allowed it to survive the loss of entire provincial governments and still keep functioning. The Inquisition was built with an internal philosophical diversity, competing schools of thought about the appropriate scope and methods of their work that allowed it to evolve and adapt across centuries as the specific nature of the threats it faced changed. The Officio Assassinorum was built with operational security so robust that it has survived multiple attempts by powerful figures to compromise or co-opt it for purposes that were not within its original mandate. And the Grey Knights were built to fight a war that had no end. That is perhaps the clearest expression of Malcador's design philosophy. He did not build the Grey Knights to win the war against chaos. He did not build them to achieve a victory condition that would render them unnecessary. He built them to fight a war that would never be over, against enemies that could never be permanently destroyed, under conditions that would be psychically and spiritually and physically grueling in ways that would have destroyed any less carefully constructed force. The selection criteria for Grey Knights are among the most stringent in the Imperium. It is not enough to be powerful. It is not enough to be loyal. It is not enough to be brave or skilled or dedicated. The specific combination of psychic ability, resistance to demonic corruption, and mental stability under conditions of extreme spiritual assault, and pure martial excellence that a Grey Knight must embody, is so rare that the chapter has never in its history been able to maintain the full theoretical complement of 1,000 battle brothers. They exist in the hundreds, not the thousands. They are always undermanned by the standards that their mission should require, because the number of humans who can pass the selection process is simply not large enough to fill the ranks that would theoretically be needed. Malcador knew this when he built them. He designed them to be rare and extraordinary rather than numerous, because the specific function they perform requires exactly those qualities, and no amount of training can substitute for the particular combination of gifts that the selection process filters for. When he built quality into the fundamental design of the institution and accepted the constraint on quantity that this imposed. The Grey Knights are not optimized for deployment in large numbers. They are optimized for deployment in circumstances where large numbers would not be sufficient anyway. The Terminus decree fits into this design philosophy as the final element of a very long-term plan. Malcador built the Grey Knights to fight demons. He built them to maintain their purity across 10,000 years of contact with the most corrupting forces the universe contains. He built them with the psychic gifts and the training and the indomitable will that would allow them to face entities against which even Primarchs had flinched. And at the very end of all that building, had he left them a single instruction that applied not to any demon or any chaos god or any enemy in the conventional sense, but to the Emperor himself. The instruction represents Malcador's final assessment of what the long-term trajectory of the Imperium looked like. He understood that the Emperor on the Golden Throne was a stopped clock, a solution to an emergency that had been designed for a specific moment of crisis, and that could not be maintained indefinitely without something eventually giving way. The Golden Throne's long-term maintenance had always been a problem. The thousands of psychers sacrificed to it each day were a drain on humanity's psychic resources that could not be sustained forever. The machine itself, built from components whose full engineering specifications were understood only by the Emperor, and perhaps not even by him in their totality, could not be guaranteed to function for eternity. Something would eventually change. Something would eventually force the situation off its current equilibrium. Malcador did not know what that would be. He did not know when it would happen, but he designed a response to the most dangerous possible version of that change, the one where the Emperor's departure from the throne took a form that would make the Emperor himself into a new kind of threat, rather than a restored source of protection. That is the wisdom in the box. Not just the specific instruction, but the willingness to think that far ahead and plan for something that many people would have considered too remote or too unimaginable to warrant preparation. Malcador had seen enough of history to know that the things people considered too remote to plan for had a way of arriving regardless. Extended section: Implications of the Great Rift and the Failing Throne. The Terminus decree's relevance to the current state of the Warhammer 40,000 narrative is not purely theoretical. There are specific developments in the lore of the 41st Millennium that have brought the decree's conditions significantly closer to being met. And understanding those developments is necessary for understanding why the box is such an active part of the current community conversation. Yet the most significant of these is the simple mechanical fact that the Golden Throne is failing. This is not speculation or fan theory. It is established lore, confirmed in multiple sources across the most recent editions of the game and the most recent novels in the Black Library's active publication line. The machine is breaking down. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who consider the maintenance of the throne their most sacred responsibility, have determined that they do not know how to fix it. The engineering knowledge required to properly service the Golden Throne has been lost over 10,000 years of partial understanding and increasingly desperate improvisation. The throne is not going to last forever. The question that the current state of the lore leaves hanging in the air is what happens when it finally fails beyond the ability of 10,000 sacrificed psychers a day to compensate for. If the throne fails, the Emperor's situation changes. In what direction that change goes is the central mystery of the current narrative, the most hopeful reading, and the one that certain factions within the in-universe fiction actively promote, is that the Emperor might be freed from the throne to return to some kind of active existence, potentially reborn or revitalized in a form that allows him to directly guide humanity again. The most pessimistic reading, and the one that the Terminus decree seems most relevant to, is that what emerges from the throne when it finally fails might not be what went in. In the Deep Imperialis series of novels, and particularly in the Vaults of Terror trilogy, there are descriptions of the Emperor's current condition that are not reassuring. The being on the throne has been fed by the psychic deaths of 10,000 psychers a day for 100 centuries. The total psychic energy that has been poured into the throne is a number so large that it ceases to have intuitive meaning. Whatever the Emperor was when Malcador held his place on that seat, whatever that original being's nature and personality and values were, the thing that currently exists in that golden chair has been absorbing and transforming and accumulating and changing for a span of time that is roughly equivalent to all of human recorded history. The Dark King thread, introduced in the final volumes of the Siege of Terror series, suggests that the Emperor's path of psychic accumulation is not without its dangers. The being that nearly emerged during the Horus heresy, that would have been born from the Emperor's willingness to drink deeply from the warp's power in order to match Horus, was not the Emperor. It was something that incorporated the Emperor's consciousness while transforming it into an instrument of something the ruinous powers could recognize and work with. That path was closed, or at least deferred, by the choice that was made on the vengeful spirit. But closed and deferred are very different things, and 10,000 years of additional accumulation may have brought that threshold back into range. The soul fragment that the Emperor shed when he gave up the Dark King's power is still out there. The lore describes it as something slowly growing, and a small light in the warp that carries the parts of the Emperor that could not coexist with the decision he had to make. The compassion, the love, the hope, the specifically human emotional core that the Emperor had to set aside to do what needed to be done. If that fragment and the Emperor on the throne were ever to be reunited, the being that resulted might be something different from either component, might be something that had both the immense power accumulated over 10 millennia and the emotional humanity that was shed before the throne. Whether that resulting being would be the Emperor of legend or the Dark King or something entirely new is a question the lore has not answered. The Terminus decree exists to manage the worst-case version of that answer. If what comes off the throne is something that needs to be put back, then the Grey Knights will put it back. That is the instruction. That is the seal. That is the contingency that Malcador prepared and left behind in a wooden box on Saturn's moon, because he understood that the best-case and the worst-case scenarios are not always distinguishable from each other in the moments that matter, and somebody needed to have the authority and the will to make the decision in either case. Extended section: The Grey Knights as Malcador's truest legacy. It is fashionable in discussions of Warhammer 40,000 lore to compare the various institutions and figures in terms of their lasting impact on the setting. The Primarchs are obvious candidates for this kind of assessment. Guilliman's Codex Astartes shaped 10,000 years of Space Marine organization. Lorga's conversion to chaos initiated the Horus heresy. Magnus's miscalculation began the chain of events that destroyed the Emperor's Webway project. The founding figures of the great institutions, the original High Lords, the architects of the Second Founding, all left marks on the Imperium that are still visible in the 41st millennium. Malcador's marks are arguably the deepest, precisely because he was the one who thought most carefully about duration. The Administratum is everywhere and unremarkable, the way the most essential infrastructure always becomes unremarkable. The Inquisition is feared and omnipresent, the nervous system of the Imperium's self-preservation instinct. But the Grey Knights are something different. The Grey Knights are the only institution in the Imperium that exists in a direct, unbroken, as materially manifest connection to the event horizon of the setting's deepest crisis. Every Grey Knight alive today bears gene seed drawn from the Emperor's own genetic blueprint, a chain of biological inheritance that connects directly to the man on the Golden Throne. Every Grey Knight lives and fights and trains in a fortress built by Malcador's design and maintained according to traditions that Malcador established, and carries the Sigillite's mark on his skin and in his armor. Every Supreme Grand Master who has ever led the chapter has carried alone the final instruction of the man who built everything they are. This creates a kind of institutional memory that is qualitatively different from anything else in the Imperium. The Grey Knights do not merely remember Malcador the way the Ultramarines remember Guilliman or the Space Wolves remember Leman Russ, through legend and ritual and the preserved artifacts of a distant past. They are connected to Malcador through the living tissue of their chapter's design. The very gene seed in their bodies, the enhanced genetics that make them Space Marines and Psychers both, connects them biologically to the Emperor who authorized the chapter. The Sigillite's mark on their gauntlets is not symbolic. It is the seal that Malcador bore throughout his life and died bearing, preserved and replicated and worn by every warrior who has earned the right to call themselves Grey Knight. In this sense, the Terminus decree is not just an instruction. It is the final expression of a relationship that spans the full length of the setting's history. Malcador served the Emperor faithfully for thousands of years before the Grey Knights existed. He served the Emperor for the last time on the Golden Throne, at the cost of his own existence. And then he left behind this final inheritance, this last act of service, in the hands of the chapter that carries both of their marks, asking them to continue the work that he and the Emperor together had begun, to protect humanity from the worst possible outcomes, to make the hard choices when the hard choices needed making, to be, in the most fundamental sense, the last resort. There is something that is almost tender about it, when you approach it from that direction. The old man who had seen everything, who had made the hard choices countless times himself, and carried the weight of them without flinching, choosing the Grey Knights as the recipients of his final trust. Not the Custodes, who were the Emperor's direct bodyguard, but who answered to the Emperor's will above all other considerations. Not the Inquisition, which was designed for investigation and enforcement, but whose authority was always theoretically answerable to higher powers within the Imperium's structure. The Grey Knights, who existed outside all of that, answerable only to the highest possible authority, given a command that superseded every other command they would ever receive. In the Horus Heresy novels, there is a moment where Malcador reflects that an act of compassion might be what the age needs. But when he allows Garviel Loken to leave Terra on a rescue mission rather than executing him for insubordination, it is one of those small moments that reveals something important about who Malcador actually was, beneath all the calculation and the long game planning and the willingness to do the terrible things that the terrible situation required. He was not a machine optimizing for outcomes. He was a person, albeit a person of extraordinary age and power and complexity, who had genuine feelings about the individuals around him and who sometimes let those feelings influence his decisions. That Malcador, the one who let Loken go because an act of compassion felt right, even in the darkness, is the same Malcador who left the box on Titan. And is the same Malcador who helped Rogal Dorn prepare the defenses of Terra, while knowing that the siege would kill most of the people involved in that defense. The same Malcador who walked up the steps of the Golden Throne, knowing that he would not walk back down. The same Malcador who used the very last of his life to give the Emperor one more moment of consciousness, one more opportunity to set things in order before the long sleep began. He was both things, the cold strategist running the 10,000-year calculation, and the old friend who said goodbye to the Emperor on the steps of his prison and made sure the Emperor knew it was worth it. The box contains the cold calculation, the act of creating the Grey Knights, us of spending his last significant reserves of psychic power before the throne to send Titan into the warp and ensure the chapter's survival, contains the other thing. His greatest legacy is that both of those things, the calculation and the compassion, survive him. The Grey Knights are the calculation, precisely designed, perfectly optimized for their function, ruthlessly uncompromising in their standards. And they are also something else, something that Malcador planted in their charter and their training and their culture, a belief that what they do matters not as an abstraction, but as a real and specific service to a real and specific humanity that deserves protection. They do not fight because they are programmed to fight. They fight because they understand what they are fighting for, and they have chosen it every day, in the way that choice is possible for beings constructed as carefully as they have been. The Terminus decree is the inheritance of that choosing. The final instruction from the man who made the choice to build the Grey Knights, passed forward into a future he did not live to see, trusting that the people he had built would make the right choice when the time came. The box sits in its chamber, patient, waiting, bearing the seal that matches the seal on the golden throne. The day it is opened, if that day ever comes, will be the day the Grey Knights face the most impossible task they have ever been assigned. The day they must tell the Emperor himself, or whatever the Emperor has become, that his rest is over and his duty is not yet done. The day they must force the most powerful psychic entity in human history back into a machine, due with no instructions for how to accomplish that, armed only with the absolute certainty that it is what needs to be done. Malcador believed they could do it. He believed it enough to make it his last instruction. He believed it enough to build the people who would carry it for 100 centuries without knowing what they were carrying, trusting them to be equal to the moment when the moment arrived. That is what the box contains, not just an instruction, a belief in the people who would receive it. And perhaps, in the grim darkness of the far future, that is not nothing at all. Extended section. The seal and the symbolism. A reading of the box. Let us return one final time to the question of the golden seal, but approach it from a different angle. We have talked about what it authenticates and what it connects. But there is another reading of the seal that rewards consideration, one that is a little more personal and a little less institutional. Malcador was the sigillite, the seal bearer. His entire life, for thousands of years, had been defined by the act of bearing the seal, of carrying the Emperor's authority into spaces where the Emperor himself could not go, speaking with a voice that was not quite the Emperor's, but that carried the Emperor's full sanction. The seal was his identity in the most fundamental way, more fundamental than his name, more fundamental than his age, more fundamental even than the extraordinary psychic gifts that made him one of the most powerful human beings who had ever lived. He was the seal bearer, and the last seal he bore was the one he pressed into the box he left on Titan. Now, think about that for a moment in terms of what it would have meant to a person of Malcador's awareness and symbolic sensibility. He had spent his entire life bearing other people's seals, acting as the mechanism by which the Emperor's authority was transmitted into the world. His title was defined by that function. His power was derived from that function. And here, at the very end, in the act of sealing the box and leaving it in the chamber next to his memorial tomb, he was doing the same thing one final time, bearing the seal, transmitting an authority, not the Emperor's authority this time, but the combined authority of the Emperor and himself, forward into a future that neither of them would directly experience. The act of creating the Terminus decree is an act of seal-bearing in its purest and most personal form. It is Malcador doing the thing he was named for, the thing he had done for thousands of years, one last time, carrying the mark, ensuring the authority would outlast the person bearing it. There is also something significant in the choice of a wooden box, not a golden reliquary, not an adamantium vault, not an elaborate mechanical lock sealed with biometric and psychic verification protocols of the kind that the more elaborate imperial institutions might have designed for something this sensitive. A plain wooden box, the kind of thing that is humble and immediate and almost uncomfortably ordinary given the magnitude of what it contains. Malcador was always most comfortable with the ordinary. His quarters in the imperial palace, in the descriptions we have of them, It contained two paintings that he had rescued from the chaos of the Age of Strife, the Mona Lisa and sunflowers. These are not the trophies of a man who wanted to surround himself with the symbols of power. They are the choices of a person who understood the value of beauty that was scaled to human experience rather than to the grandeur of civilization building. A woman's enigmatic smile, a vase of bright flowers against a warm golden wall, things that reminded you what it was like to be a person rather than a symbol. The wooden box is in that tradition. The last thing Malcador made is also the most human thing he left behind, a plain, ordinary object containing a secret of cosmic importance, which is perhaps the most accurate symbolic representation of Malcador himself that the setting could possibly produce. His cosmic importance in an ordinary wrapper, vast consequence in an unassuming form. The old man in pale robes who looked like 1,000 other functionaries and who was secretly the second most powerful psyker in the history of humanity. The architect of the Inquisition and the Grey Knights, the friend of the Emperor, the last of the Sigillites, bearing his final seal in a wooden box on a hidden moon of Saturn. Malcador the Sigillite. Malcador the hero. The man who, when the galaxy needed someone to hold the door shut while the Emperor went to face his fallen son, walked up those steps without being asked twice, and sat in the chair that would kill him, and held the door shut for as long as it needed to be held. The box is the last word of a man who very rarely let himself have the last word. He always preferred to let events speak and to position himself in the silences between them, working through others, shaping outcomes without insisting on being seen as the cause. But the box is his voice, preserved for 10,000 years in a plain wooden container, speaking with a clarity and a directness that everything else in his life carefully avoided. This is what must happen. This is the instruction. This is what the Grey Knights are for. When the moment comes, they will know, and they will act. The seal on the box is not just authentication. It is Malcador's final statement of who he was and what he stood for, the bearer of the seal to the very end. Or extended section, what the community got right and what it missed. In the years between the Terminus decree's introduction in 2011 and its partial revelation in the 10th edition Codex, released in 2024 and circulated through the community in mid-2025, the Warhammer 40,000 community generated an extraordinary range of theories about its contents. These theories are worth examining not just as historical curiosities, but because they reveal something important about how the community engages with the setting's deepest mysteries and what they believe the setting valued. The most popular and persistently discussed theory class was what you might call the salvation theories. These were frameworks that imagined the Terminus decree as containing some form of path toward genuine hope, a method of resurrecting the Emperor, and a ritual to free his soul from the throne for a proper rebirth, a set of coordinates for some ancient pre-heresy weapon that could end the threat of chaos at a fundamental level. These theories were popular because they expressed the thing that Warhammer 40,000's darkest storytelling makes people secretly want: the possibility of a real resolution, of the misery having some kind of purpose that eventually pays off. The second most popular theory class was what you might call the escalation theories. These imagined the Terminus decree as a weapon of extraordinary scale, something that acknowledged the situation was beyond recovery and committed to burning everything down in the hope that whatever came after would be better. The bioweapon capable of killing all transhumans falls into this category, as does the theory that the decree contained instructions for triggering a catastrophic warp implosion that would collapse the Eye of Terror permanently at the cost of enormous collateral damage to the surrounding galaxy. A third category was the more philosophically uncomfortable theories, the ones that took the setting's grimdark tone most seriously and imagined the Terminus decree as something that acknowledged no hope at all. Instructions for a dignified final end, a record of humanity's greatest achievements, preserved in some format that would outlast the civilization itself, so that whatever came after would know what humanity had been. A statement of principles and values to be passed on to whatever intelligent life inherited humanity's place in the galaxy after humanity's story ended. The actual revelation fell outside all three categories, which in retrospect is part of what made it so interesting. It is not a salvation theory. It does not offer a path to the Emperor's recovery or the defeat of chaos. It is not an escalation theory. It does not commit to a scorched earth response to total defeat. It is not a dignified end theory. It explicitly commits to the continuation of a situation that the text itself describes as terrible. What it is, instead, is something far more specific to the Warhammer 40,000 setting and to Malcador's character. A contingency. A planned response to a specific failure mode. Not a vision of victory, and not an acceptance of defeat, but an instruction designed to prevent a particular bad outcome from becoming a worse one. The Emperor must not become the Dark King. The Emperor must not ascend to a chaos-adjacent warp entity. The Emperor must not leave the throne in any form that would replace the current desperately difficult stalemate with something actively catastrophic. If any of those things happen, the Grey Knights must stop them. The community was not entirely wrong in its various theories. The salvation theories correctly intuited that the decree had something to do with the Emperor's future on or off the throne. The escalation theories correctly intuited that the decree contained some form of potentially galaxy-altering instruction. The philosophical end-state theories correctly intuited that the decree acknowledged the possibility of genuine civilization-ending scenarios. What none of the theories quite captured was the specific texture of Malcador's thinking. Not hopeful, not despairing, was not resigned, but pragmatic. Still planning, still preparing contingencies, still treating the situation as one that required a response rather than an acceptance. The community response to the revelation was itself a microcosm of something important about how fiction that withholds information eventually has to decide what to do with that information. The arguments that the decree should have remained sealed, that the mystery was more valuable than the answer, were genuine and not without merit. Warhammer 40,000 has always been a setting that uses mystery strategically, letting the gaps in knowledge generate as much narrative energy as the things that are explicitly stated. The two lost Primarchs, the missing legions, the full truth of the Emperor's original plan. These are mysteries that have never been resolved and that continue to generate discussion and investment precisely because they are open. But the Terminus decree was never quite the same kind of mystery, even though it was treated as one for 14 years. It was not a mystery about the past, about what happened or who did what or what the consequences were. It was a mystery about the future, about what will happen and what will be done, and whether the contingency will ever be activated. Resolving the question of what the decree says does not close the story around it. It opens it. Now we know what the Grey Knights are supposed to do. We do not know whether they will have to do it. We do not know whether they would succeed if they tried. We do not know what the Emperor himself would think about the instruction, on whether the being on the throne has the capacity to think about anything in the way we mean when we use that phrase. The mystery has not been solved. It has been transformed. The question is no longer what is written on the parchment. The question is what happens next. And that, in the end, is what good lore is supposed to do. The box sits on Titan. The seal holds. The Supreme Grand Master carries the weight of knowing, alone, in the cold corridors of a fortress built from basalt and sacrifice, and the oldest kind of hope that the setting contains. The hope that if you build the right contingencies, and trust the right people, and think far enough ahead, the worst outcomes might still be manageable. Malcador believed that. He built his life around it. He died for it. And he left behind one last instruction, sealed in a plain wooden box, are to be carried forward by the people he trusted most, into a future he could not see. The box waits, the seal holds, and somewhere in the grim darkness of the far future, the story is still being written.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.